So, it seems like Bioshock Infinite failed to defeat the System Shock cycle. While a lot of people disagreed with my reading of Bioshock Infinite's meta-narrative, after playing Burial at Sea, I'm going to have to double down on it. So let's start out with a quick recap of what aspects of that game are going to be important to this DLC. Firstly, Bioshock Infinite says that free will is an illusion. Since it's impossible to know what our choices will lead to, we'll never truly be able to decide for ourselves.
No one tells me where to go.
Booker, you've already been.
While this applies more literally to player characters like Gordon Freeman and Solid Snake, with their predestined stories written long before the player ever got a hold of them, it applies to us in the real world just as much. Whether or not we actually have what we traditionally think of as free will in reality is more or less impossible to know, but whether we do or not, without having any idea how our decisions will impact the future, it can't really be called free will. Then what about Elizabeth? She can see through the multiverse, and she knows exactly how each decision will impact the future. Well, for the game's metaphorical answer to this question, naturally, it will need to get meta. Bioshock Infinite revealed the Bioshock formula to all of us. There's always a city, there's always two men, there's always a transhumanist invention that gives us power, the player character is always more closely linked to the city than we were led to believe. Elizabeth can see this, as can the player after finishing Bioshock Infinite. Well, then what is the point in making more Bioshock games? I know Bioshock 4 was just announced, but Ken Levine won't be working on it, and even if he were, how could he possibly up the ante on Infinite's story? Infinite pulled the curtain up and showed us what goes on backstage in a Bioshock game. There simply can't be any more games that follow the System Shock cycle in a post-Bioshock Infinite world. So back to Elizabeth. As we see in Burial at Sea, her knowing what every decision will lead to just results in her killing yet another Comstock and getting herself killed in the process.
I am so sorry.
No, you're not. But you're about to be.
I can only imagine that she's dedicated her life to going from reality to reality, killing Comstock after Comstock forever. While her drowning Booker at the end of Bioshock Infinite probably killed the vast majority of Comstocks, clearly some of them remained. In simple terms, Elizabeth is living an utterly meaningless life up until she dies, and it's all because she knows exactly what her choices will lead to, and she's all caught up in trying to make the whole multiverse a better place instead of just her world. Again, whether you know exactly what every choice leads to, as Elizabeth does, or are constantly facing regret for your decisions, free will is a finite thing, and the two protagonists have slowly used up all of theirs and end up just becoming trapped by their free will. Before I entered this room, I could have been the Booker that went left or right, but now that I'm on the other side, I know which one I am, and I've lost the ability to make that decision again. I'm trapped by that decision, even on this small of a scale. This applies to real-life people as much as it does these two, but it also applies to something else. The Bioshock series as a whole. When Bioshock 1 came out, it was a clever little game about a man's philosophy gone wrong, and how players will never truly have free will in the games they play. We'll ignore Bioshock 2 for now, as it wasn't directed by Ken Levine. When creating Bioshock Infinite, I assume Ken Levine wrote a story that he then realized had a lot of parallels with Bioshock 1, and this is where the Bioshock series hit its fork in the path. Bioshock could either go left and hope that players didn't notice how much of that game was a find and replace for Bioshock 1, or it could go right and showcase that the plotlines to Bioshock games were inevitably linked no matter how much was changed, simply because they were part of the same series. Change how many weapons can be equipped, change the city from a subaquatic one to one based in the skies with a completely different philosophy behind it, give the protagonist a voice, it doesn't matter. It's still a Bioshock game. Well, with Infinite, Bioshock took the right path and showed us how inevitable the worlds of Bioshock are. It was a bold decision, but ultimately I see it as both an attempt to blow the audience's mind and an attempt to end the Shock series, to put an end to the System Shock cycle. Well, one game simply doesn't have the power to end the cycle, especially when that cycle began 18 years earlier with a game that most people consider to be part of an entirely different series. The best it could possibly hope to do is end the Bioshock series. While this is the part of my previous video that people had a problem with, I'm sticking by it. I think that this post-credits scene is Bioshock Infinite's way of acknowledging that it simply didn't have the power to kill the series, even if it revealed the formula that Bioshock games live off of. Sure, Elizabeth and Booker went back in time to before the baptism and killed Booker, but this just wasn't enough to stop Comstock from being born and Booker from destroying his life. The fact that Booker even exists to play out this post-credits sequence is evidence of that. As I said in my previous video, this post-credits scene may as well have said, "Stay tuned folks, the System Shock formula is coming back soon." Well, while some people told me that Burial at Sea disproved this motion, I see it the exact opposite way. I think Burial of Sea only fortifies my reading of Infinite. There were still infinite Comstocks and infinite Bookers, and the first episode of Burial at Sea just so happened to take place in the shoes of a Comstock that ended up in Rapture. As I said earlier, I see Elizabeth's appearance here as just one of her countless missions to travel to different realities and kill as many Comstocks as possible. The fact that Elizabeth even exists means that she isn't done yet, and more Comstocks and Bookers need to die to put an end to the cycle, but she simply can't go far enough back in time to kill them all.
Things get set in motion.
How would one know how far back to go?
While all of these rules and stipulations on Elizabeth's powers can get pretty confusing from a literal perspective, they start to make more sense when you consider them from a meta perspective. If, from that meta perspective, Elizabeth's goal is to destroy the Shock series, then of course she can't kill every Comstock. As I said, no single game has the power to destroy a series that started 18 years prior. She can't even destroy the first Bioshock game, and that was only 6 years prior. In Burial at Sea, Episode 2, Elizabeth starts out living it up in France. She died in Rapture, and this is a sort of heaven for her. With her death, she accepted that she didn't have the power to kill every Comstock, and by extension Bioshock as a whole. She saw beyond that door. However, as soon as she sees a reminder of this failure, Sally, she gets pulled back into Rapture. Now that she can't see all the doors, she can't see for certain that she's unable to stop Bioshock from ever happening. She decides to take one last whack at ending the series. She's going to give Bioshock a burial at sea. Well, over the course of the game, all the strange coincidences that lead to Bioshock 1's events are perpetrated by Elizabeth. Elizabeth is the reason that the Big Daddies were able to imprint on the Little Sisters and ended up killing Dr. Suchong. She's the reason Fontaine was able to return to Rapture as Atlas and use his army to take over the city, and above all else, she's the reason Fontaine is able to control Jack with the phrase, "Would you kindly?"
What does this say?
It says, "Would you kindly?"
No matter what Elizabeth does here, whether she completes her mission without killing anyone, whether she saves Sally or not, or even if she dies, she's inevitably going to set the events of Bioshock 1 in motion.
We both know what happens next. Just get it over with.
Well, love, if you insist.
While Bioshock Infinite might have tried its hardest to tie a neat little bow around Bioshock and the Shock series as a whole, it just wasn't able to undo the past. It wasn't able to go back in time and kill Bioshock in the crib. Bioshock already happened, and nothing can change that.
No one tells me where to go.
Booker, you've already been.
Bioshock Infinite took the right path. It showed us how inevitable the plots of Bioshock games are in an attempt to make sure that it was the last Shock game. It wanted to break the circle. Well, as it turns out, it didn't have that power. It couldn't possibly. Will the circle be unbroken? Absolutely.
Will the circle be unbroken by and by, by and by? Is a better